I should begin, ladies and gentlemen, by telling you just a little more about myself. Lee has given you a brief introduction. I am indeed a sixth-generation New Zealander and a sixth-generation South Islander, as it says there. Although I may speak proper, I didn't go to a posh school. Our family was just an ordinary, happy, hard-working family like everyone else's. I was a studious, dutiful child. And I benefited from our excellent public education system. I studied law at university and became a lawyer and an academic, and I have had just one job in my entire adult life, which is the old New Zealand. And I found teaching law a very congenial occupation, and I hope a useful occupation for present purposes, because a good lawyer will be able to cut through nonsense and recognise it for what it is. And an academic should be looking at the big picture. We should be watching and thinking and looking far ahead. And I might also add that all my life I've loved our country, the bush, the sea, the mountains. I'm a tramper and an environmentalist. And indeed, I first began to take an interest in treaty issues a good time ago now, when it appeared that large areas of the conservation estate were being considered by governments, and by a national government in particular, as a potential cheap way of settling Maori treaty claims. So that's me. I've been watching and worrying. Academics are supposed to be worrying. We have a statutory obligation to act as a critic and conscience of society, and I'm afraid that I am worried. And as an academic, I am also very much aware of the power of ideas. We all have ideas, very often ideas which seem so obvious and natural that we don't even realise that we have them. They're just like the air we breathe, the water that fish swim in. They're just part of the natural order of the universe. And so we don't think of them at all, but they're there and they underlie all history. There's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And a very good argument has been put forward that the French Revolution, for example, was ultimately caused not by social conditions and oppressions in France, which were not any worse than in many other parts of Europe, but rather by the exciting new daring ideas of natural rights and liberty, equality and fraternity, which were tossed about unthinkingly by fashionable aristocrats and their salons, and gradually came to infect a large part of the body politic, and that led to the hideous atrocities of the revolution, and ultimately to the military dictatorship of Bonaparte, a generation of European war, untold horror and misery, and the deaths of millions. Ideas have consequences, as Northern Ireland, closer to home, reminds us. Give a man a grudge and he has a friend for life, and indeed a friend for generations. And New Zealand has been blessed among nations. Our history since 1840 has been almost entirely peaceful. It's been a history of honest labour, decent life, and increasing prosperity. And we have been blessed because, among other things, we have not suffered from the clashes of race and culture and ideology which have cursed so many other nations. And yet we seem determined now to create a problem where no problem, certainly no great problem, has existed hitherto. And if I may quote Chris Trotter, here is Chris Trotter writing in the Christchurch Press a couple of years ago, and he wrote, "The extraordinary fact of the past 40 years of our history is the manner in which this bold rejection of Captain Hobson's famous declaration at Waitangi, He iwi tahi tatou, now we are one people, has become the official policy of the New Zealand state. Not, I hasten to add, the policy of the New Zealand people, who have never been given the opportunity to formally endorse or reject the separatist two nations in one state orthodoxy, which now prevails in our universities and throughout the public service." And I have to add that although, he's right about the universities, especially perhaps North Island ones, but even at Canterbury, although my own freedom of speech has always been scrupulously respected, for which I'm very grateful, I'm conscious that I am swimming somewhat against the tide there. But if I could just widen the area of discussion for a minute, there's a great deal of misunderstanding about and a great deal of stupidity spoken about diversity. Now we have to face this point head on. Diversity is held up to us as a wonderful idea. Some people want New Zealand to be as diverse a nation as possible. A Christchurch MP, a national MP again, I happen to be on her mailing list, Nikki Wagner, very nice lady. She celebrates the fact in a recent newsletter that Christchurch is now such a diverse place as to be home to over 100 different cultures. But diversity is not something good in itself. My students do not celebrate the fact that I give them diverse grades from A+ down to D and E. What they would like is uniform A's. We don't celebrate the fact that some people enjoy good health and others don't. We don't want diversity in health. We want uniform good health. And as far as cultures go, a bit of diversity is fine, although all too often when you have arguments with liberals on this matter, the justification for diversity ends up as just a wider range of ethnic restaurants. But nevertheless, diversity means difference. As we become more diverse, we become more different. We have less and less in common. Fellow citizens become strangers to each other. We have different priorities and desires. So diversity is inevitably a recipe for discord and strife. Now, some diversity is inevitable in any society, and a little diversity certainly is pleasant. Variety is the spice of life. Diversity is the spice of life. But if I might extend that metaphor, a spice is not a staple. Spice is not the basic bread, diversity is not the basic bread and butter around which any coherent society has to be organised. Any coherent society has to agree on basic things. And in the past in New Zealand, we have, by and large, had such agreement. We've agreed on racial equality, we've agreed on democracy, one adult, one vote, the equality of the sexes, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. If we don't agree on fundamental things like that, if different cultures insist on something different, then we have an insoluble problem. When some people insist that their race or their religion or their culture demands special consideration, then we are starting to fall apart as a nation. We're no longer a nation, we're just different groups of strangers who happen to inhabit the same piece of ground. Now, when there's talk of a new national flag, one justification often offered for that new national flag is that a new flag would recognise New Zealand's diversity. Now, that is a totally stupid thing to say, because a flag is one thing which sums up what our nation is. And if we are diverse, if we're divided into different tribes of race and culture and religion and interest, then we have different desires and objectives and identities, and one flag is impossible. A diverse nation has to have 100 different flags. That's what diversity means. Now, that's a slight digression from the main point, perhaps, but it is relevant, its background, because the acceptance and promotion of Maori tribalism by our political and pseudo-intellectual leaders is motivated by the same assumption that diversity is wonderful. It's so wonderful, in fact, that it should be created and promoted where it doesn't actually exist. And this, I suggest, is a fundamentally stupid policy. Why is it that people fight? In Northern Ireland, in Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, the Pacific, everywhere, people fight because they are different. Their differences may be racial or religious or even ideological or political, but they fight essentially because they are members of different tribes, however you define those tribes. Their first loyalty is not to the nation state, but to their own particular tribe or interest group, whose interests come first. That's the problem. And it's a problem which we here should be trying to avoid, not promote. But here in New Zealand, we have intellectual visionaries, as they like to think of themselves, who foresee a tribal Aotearoa as an ideal we should be working towards. A New Zealand of, and I'm quoting, Ngāti Maori, Ngāti Pākehā, Ngāti Pacifica, Ngāti Asia. This is an ideal that's held up to us. Now, the people who promote these ideals are racists. I believe, and I'm sure that you believe also, that a human being's worth has nothing to do with the colour of his or her skin or that of his or her ancestors. And I do not believe that anyone should be entitled to claim special legal or political or economic privileges on the ground of racial ancestry. And indeed, scientists and biologists now tell us that the very idea of different, distinct races is an absurdity. I'm not quite sure how they explain differences in physical appearance. If they don't have some basis in genetics, I don't know. But in any case, you and I agree that race, whatever it is, if it exists at all, whatever it is, it should certainly not be any basis for legal or political or economic distinction. The assistance of the community should be made available on the basis of need and not race. And in any case, of course, whatever racial difference may have existed a century and a half ago has been largely obliterated by a century and a half of intermarriage. Brute physical facts have been making us one people for a century and a half. The idea that a drop of Maori blood or a shallow and recent identification with Maori culture makes you different and gives you a special entitlement is dangerous, divisive, bloody nonsense. And when I say bloody, I'm not using bad language. I'm using the word in its literal sense as what might be the consequence. Because if you'll allow me, just as one example to quote, look, here is a book I wrote some years ago, published in 1998, Truth or Treaty? Common sense questions about the treaty. And in my chapter on Maori sovereignty, I look at various suggestions about what Maori sovereignty might mean. And here is the view of Wira Gardner, former chief executive of Te Puni Kokiri, the Ministry of Maori Development, former Maori vice president of the National Party, and of course the husband of Hekia Parata, the current Minister of Education. And he wrote this at the time when Yugoslavia was breaking up. And you remember the hideous atrocities and genocide of Yugoslavia. And this is an exact quote from him. He rejects the common criticism that tribalism is divisive and is holding Maori back. What we are seeing in Bosnia is a desire by Bosnians to return to ethnic roots. The Bosnians, Croats, Serbs and Muslims were forcibly placed together this century. The breakup of Yugoslavia shows that tribalism is not dead. Of course it is going to cause trouble, but just because it creates problems doesn't mean that it's wrong. So there you are, the unspeakable atrocities, bloodshed, genocide of Yugoslavia. They're just problems about which this particular Maori activist isn't unduly concerned. No, we've just got to break a few eggs in the creation of the wonderful new tribal omelette of Aotearoa. That we've been told. That is the direction we are heading. And Yugoslavia, Wira Gardner has said, Yugoslavia is our future. The time is long past when the treaty was an argument for fairness and racial equality and the righting of past wrongs. Now, I'm sure that we're not going to argue that genuine historical grievances should not be righted. Although, having said that, of course, we must add that what justice actually requires in these situations can be a tricky question. Because, after all, there have been previous full and final settlements of quite a few treaty claims, and they were undoubtedly considered at the time to be generous and full and final. You may be interested to know, you probably know already, that there are many Maori now saying more or less openly that no treaty settlement is ever going to be full and final. An entire book has just been published on this matter, Treaty of Waitangi Settlements. I was forced to read it from cover to cover last year to review it for publication. And there are a dozen authors of essays in this book. And the general refrain of all of them is that treaty claims will never end. They make this quite clear. For one reason or another, past settlements of claims weren't good enough. It might just be that they want more now and they're breaking their word, but that doesn't matter because they've got the treaty, and their interpretation of the treaty says essentially that they can have anything they want and there's going to be trouble if they don't get it, and nothing else is justice. And even if at some future time they do decide that they won't make another treaty claim, that's not the end of the story, because then the Crown and Maori will just move on to a new phase in their relationship.